Chapter 8 of your textbook is all about vocabulary. It's important that we explicitly teach vocabulary to students. At one point, it was thought, oh, if students just read a lot, they will naturally develop their vocabulary. That is not true. It is true for a small group of students, but it's not true in general. That doesn't mean that reading a lot isn't important. It is. And the more students read, the better their vocabularies will be, but they need the core to be explicitly taught. And so, what this means is that as students study texts in your content area, whether it be a traditional textbook or an article in health class, you need to give students multiple opportunities to develop their understandings of what those words mean and how those words are related to each other. So, if you are reading a chapter in a science book on mitosis and meiosis in sixth grade science, there's going to be lots of vocabulary beyond mitosis and meiosis in that textbook chapter, and that vocabulary is conceptually related to each other. You know that as a science educator, your students might not recognize that. There are different ways to classify vocabulary words. This is the way that your text uses. Tier 1 words are the words that are in common use in everyday language. These are words that very often your students will already know unless they are English learners. And so if they're learning English or if they maybe have certain types of learning or other disabilities, in that case, maybe they won't. But these are words that are used a lot. They are very useful in reading and writing. Tier 2, your textbook defines as high frequency, high utility words used by more advanced or mature language learners. This is partially what an educated vocabulary sounds like compared to an uneducated vocabulary. These are words that are not just in your content area, but that are useful for students to know to develop rich, deep vocabularies that will help them in life and will help them in all content areas, including yours. And then tier 3 are words that are low frequency. These are words that are not used a lot outside of your content area, like mitosis or like longitude in geography, um, things like that. These are words that are important in a content area, but aren't widely used in regular life or might have a different meaning. Again, there are other ways that words are classified, but this is how your textbook classifies them. So I mentioned that words in your texts are conceptually related to each other. And so that leads to the question, what is a concept? And to help students understand what concepts are, what big ideas are, it is helpful to have them create mental images. And a concept represents anything that could be grouped together by common features or some other criteria like that. Concepts help us simplify our environment because we can group similar things together. And so, very often, a strategy is often recommended, particularly for students with disabilities, but also sometimes just because we have so much to teach in general, is to teach concepts rather than isolated facts. A common method for teaching vocabulary is through graphic organizers. There is no one perfect graphic organizer. Some of you may have used a Frere model for vocabulary instruction. Others of you may have done something else. Um, different approaches work better for different people. What you might do first as teachers is to analyze the vocabulary your students need for the reading assignment, and then think about the most important words and think of a way that you can show how those words are related. From that, you can construct a graphic organizer and introduce that to them. And then you can connect new learning to that graphic organizer. So to have students create their own graphic organizers, which is very beneficial once they've seen models by you, you might type the keywords just as a list and make copies for students in groups. Um, just have students write the words on index cards or sticky notes, and then from those individual words that students write, they can move them around to see how they relate to create their own graphic organizer. Ways to activate what students know about words. I'm not going to go through all of these um, because your textbook talks about them. Um, they are useful. You aren't going to do all of these for every lesson. Some work better for some content areas than others. An interesting one that I will share is the knowledge rating scale. This is something that I had to do when I taught middle school. We had adopted a set of reading strategies at my school before I got there. And as part of, I believe, as part of a grant, we had to show how we were using those strategies in all of our classes. And so we had to do that. We had to choose from a set of a dozen or so strategies, implement them, and provide evidence that we had done so. And so one day I was doing the knowledge rating scale with an eighth grade class where I had my students, um, you know, rate their knowledge of words that I took from. This was a language arts class that I took from their reading selection for the day, and I didn't expect a lot from it because I was doing it because I had to. It was a class of gifted learners, and although there was a lot of variation in their achievement level, so I knew that some of the learners, because some were English language learners also, so I knew that some of them were going to have some issues. But one of my strongest students um, gave herself a low rating on a word that I would have bet good money she had known. And it wasn't a case where she was just like blowing off the assignment. That wasn't in her personality. I truly believe she was honest. Like there are some students I would say, yeah, you're not taking this seriously because you gave yourselves, the same score for every word. It was clearly random. But there was a word I don't remember what it is anymore. But I was positive she knew it, and she didn't. So this can give us really new insight into our students sometimes. A good vocabulary word for you to know in this class is morpheme. And a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning that a word contains. And what does that mean? Well, a simple way of thinking about it is that prefixes and suffixes are morphemes. So the prefix un we know means not. The suffix ed makes many verbs in English past tense. Those are morphemes. So in the word uninterested, we have the morpheme un, meaning not. We have the prefix ed, meaning past tense, and then we have interest, which is itself a word, a morpheme. So that word has three morphemes in it. There is a relationship between a student's knowledge of morphology and their knowledge of vocabulary, and it can be beneficial to explicitly teach common morphemes, including common prefixes, common suffixes, to students as they relate to your content area. Your students do not know how to use dictionaries. It is not an effective vocabulary strategy to have students look up a word's definition in the dictionary and copy it. That does not help students learn vocabulary. Um, if you feel it's vital that students do that, do it very, very selectively. Very, very selectively. The traditional approach that I did when I was a student in school way back in the day of, oh, you're going to look up 10 to 20 words, maybe per subject, per unit, or per lesson, or per week in the dictionary, that does not help. However, it's important for students to learn, I would argue, how to use a dictionary because it has several important things to help students. And one is to help students understand when there are multiple meaning words. These are words that students often struggle with, especially English learners and especially learners with some types of disabilities. And so we can help students determine the best fit between a word and its definition when there are multiple definitions. We can also help students to learn how to read the pronunciation key in a glossary of a textbook or in a dictionary to help them learn how to pronounce the word. And I know this becomes less important in our internet age where you can listen to someone pronounce the word, but it can be useful to be able to do it without recourse to somebody else, especially because sometimes the internet pronunciations might not be correct or might not be correct for the student's dialect. In other words, the dialect not just of the student, but of the school and the region. So those are some of the highlights of Chapter 8. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 8. Vocabulary is important. There's a great book out there called Words, Words, Words by Janet Allen. It is a little out of date, so I don't use it anymore, although I do think a copy of it might be available in the library. Maybe as an ebook, but I'm pretty sure there's at least a physical book there for people who are around campus. So if you want to know more about vocabulary instruction, the works of Janet Allen, she's written several books, are useful tools to consider in your classrooms. Thanks for watching.